She found it in a storm, a cabin that shouldn't exist, miles from any trail, miles from anything. The door was already open when she got there, just barely, and inside, on a table nobody had touched in decades, a lantern that was still warm. Someone had been there, recently, and left. She didn't ask why. She was 21 years old, alone on a mountain in the middle of an Alaskan blizzard, with $43 to her name and a birthday nobody remembered. Asking why wasn't the priority. Surviving was. But then she found the drawer, and inside the drawer letters, old ones, and a deed wrapped in oilcloth, and a name written on the back in a hand that had been dead for 50 years. This is still ours. Do not let anyone say otherwise. Someone had been trying to take it, and now she knew. She had $43 in her checking account, a Ford Transit with a busted heater on the passenger side, a sleeping bag rated to 20 degrees that she'd been trusting at 14, and a birthday nobody remembered, including her. That was fine. Hannah Ward had stopped expecting things a long time ago. Expecting things was how you got hurt. Not the dramatic kind of hurt, not the crying in the rain kind. The quiet kind. The kind where you check your phone at 11:58 p.m. and watch midnight come and go like any other minute, and you tell yourself it doesn't matter, and almost believe it. Almost. October 14th. She'd been parked outside a gas station in Creston, Alaska since 6 in the morning, running the engine in 10-minute intervals to keep the cab warm enough to breathe. The sky was that particular shade of gray that Alaskan October does better than anywhere else. Not stormy, not dramatic, just permanently unconvinced that the sun was worth the trouble. She ate half a granola bar over the steering wheel. Thought about the other half. Ate it. A cashier in Anchorage last week had said happy birthday when her license came up. That was the whole of it. Happy birthday. Creston wasn't much. 800 people if you counted the ones who drove in from the outlying roads twice a week for groceries. One diner. One hardware store that also sold bait. One medical clinic open Tuesday and Thursday. And a tidy little general store on the corner of Main and Sycamore, with hand-painted letters on the window that said Marsh General Est. 1974, and a string of small American flags along the roofline that someone had forgotten to take down after the 4th of July. Hannah needed coffee. Real coffee, not the gas station kind that tasted like hot cardboard with ambitions. She also needed to check whether the trail up toward the northern ridge was passable after the cold snap. She had a job waiting in Fairbanks, a small historical society, with 3 boxes of deteriorating land records that needed scanning before they fell apart entirely. The kind of work she did. The kind nobody else wanted to do. But she had 3 days before she needed to be there. 3 days and an itch she couldn't name. The kind that came every October, every birthday. The feeling that the world was moving and she was parked, engine idling, waiting for something she couldn't identify. So, walk it off. That was the plan. She grabbed her pack from the back of the Transit, locked it with the one key that still worked, and crossed the street toward the marsh. The bell above the door made a sound like someone had tied a spoon to a string. The store was warm in the way only wood-heated places are. Old coffee, pine cleaner, and it took her eyes a second to adjust from the flat gray outside. Shelves ran floor to ceiling on both sides. Hardware on the left, dry goods on the right. A glass case at the far end held a small selection of things people in Creston apparently needed badly enough to put behind glass: pocket knives, fishing lures, 2 boxes of ammunition, and what appeared to be a framed photo of a golden retriever. Behind the counter, a woman in a green cardigan was restocking canned beans with the focused energy of someone who genuinely cared how the cans were arranged. She was 65, maybe 66. Silver hair pulled back, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead like a second set of eyes she'd forgotten to use. She looked up. Coffee's on the left side of the stove, she said. Mugs are above it. Quarter in the jar on the counter. Hannah found the mug. Found the jar. Put in 50 cents because the coffee was better than she expected. Passing through, the woman asked. She'd gone back to her cans. Taking a trail. The ridge north of town, if it's open. The woman tilted her head slightly, still arranging. North trail's passable. Gets narrow past the second switchback, but nothing you can't manage if you've got decent boots. She glanced at Hannah's feet. Apparently approved. Weather's supposed to hold until tonight. Good. Or that's what the app says. She set a can down. App's been wrong before. That should have been the end of it. Hannah would drink the coffee, leave the mug, ask about the trail conditions and go. That was how these interactions worked. She knew the rhythm. She was good at the rhythm. Short, complete, transactional. Nobody needed anything more from a stranger passing through, except a man came through the back door, 68 maybe, broad through the shoulders in the way of men who'd done physical work their whole lives and hadn't quite stopped. Flannel shirt, gray at the temples. He was carrying a cardboard box that was clearly heavier than he was letting on, and he set it down on the counter with the careful deliberateness of someone who'd been told to stop lifting heavy things and hadn't entirely complied. He looked at Hannah, not the way men sometimes look at young women passing through small towns. Not appraising. Something else. Something that lasted maybe 2 seconds longer than a normal glance, and then resolved into something neutral and careful. "Morning," he said. "Morning." He disappeared behind a curtain into what sounded like a back office. The woman his wife Hannah assumed watched Hannah finish the coffee. "North Trail," the woman said. "Not a question." You've got gear?" "I do." A pause. The beans were apparently done. The woman pulled a folded paper from a drawer under the counter and spread it flat. Topographic map. Old one with the kind of detail that suggested it had been drawn by someone who actually walked the terrain rather than assembled it from satellite data. She traced a line with one finger. "Stay on the marked path past the first ridge. After the second switchback, you'll see a rock formation on your left that looks like a staircase. That's your landmark. Trail gets thinner past that, but you're still on it." She looked up. "If you lose it, stay uphill. Don't go down into the drainage." Hannah leaned forward to see. The map was good. She said so. "Roy's," the woman said. "He's walked every inch of that mountain." She paused, seemed to make a small decision, and then did something Hannah didn't expect. She took a pencil from behind her ear and made a small mark. A dot off trail to the northeast. No label. No explanation. Just a dot. The man Roy came back through the curtain. His eyes went to the map, then to Hannah, then to his wife. Something passed between them. Something that had the compressed language of two people who'd been talking in shorthand for 40 years. He picked up the map, folded it along its original lines, held it out to Hannah. "Take it," he said. "Better than your phone up there." She took it. "Thank you. Storm comes in early, there's shelter marked." He tapped the folded map without opening it, like he was indicating something he'd already decided she'd find. "You'll know it when you see it." She didn't know what that meant. She put the map in her jacket pocket. "How much for the coffee?" she said. "Quarter in the jar," the woman said. "You already paid." Hannah nodded, pulled her pack up onto one shoulder, headed for the door. "Miss." She turned. The woman Edna, Hannah would learn later. Edna Marsh was looking at her with an expression that wasn't pity. It was something more careful than that, more considered. "The tray'll be there tomorrow too," Edna said. Hannah understood what she was being offered, and she didn't take it. "I know," she said. "I prefer today." She pushed the door open, the little bell spoon sound again. And then she was out in the October air, pack on her back, map in her pocket, and $43 to her name. And something that wasn't quite dread but lived in the same neighborhood, settling into the space between her shoulders. She started walking north. The trailhead was a half-mile from the marsh, past the end of the paved road and through a gap in a split-rail fence that someone had propped open with a flat stone. A wooden sign said Northern Ridge Trail, no motorized vehicles, pack out what you pack in. Someone had added in marker below, and then some. Hannah adjusted her pack and checked her gear out of habit. She did this the way other people checked their phones. Systematically. Without drama. Emergency thermal blanket folded tight. Waterproof matches in a case. 2 liters of water, energy bars, small first aid kit. Headlamp. Backup battery. A short length of paracord. Her scanner tucked in its padded sleeve because she carried it everywhere, habitual, the way some people carry books. And the thermohygrometer. Small enough to fit in her palm. She clipped it to her pack strap where she could read it without stopping. These weren't precautions. This was just how she operated. She'd learned early in a way that gets taught without words that nobody was coming if things went sideways. That the only reliable safety net was the one you built and maintained yourself, quietly, without making it a whole thing. She stepped through the fence gap and started up. The trail was good for the first mile. Packed earth with a light crust of frost that crunched satisfyingly under her boots. The forest on either side was spruce and birch. old growth close to the trail and younger trees further in where the light got through. The air had that Alaskan clarity that felt like breathing through a filter, everything sharper, every sound more distinct. She paid attention to the trees. This was not a poetic impulse. This was practical. The way moss grew on a trunk told you things about consistent light exposure, which told you things about which direction you were actually facing versus which direction you thought you were facing. The angle of old wind damage in the canopy told you about prevailing weather patterns. The presence or absence of animal sign tracks, scratch marks, scat told you about recent activity in the area. Whether that activity had continued or stopped. She noticed somewhere around the 40-minute mark that the birds had gone quiet, not all at once, gradually, the way they do before a change, not because they decide to stop, but because something in the air shifts and they respond to it the way they've responded to it for 10,000 generations, which is to say instinctively and without consultation. She checked the hygrometer. Humidity was climbing. Temperature had dropped a degree since she'd checked 20 minutes ago. She stopped on a flat section of trail and looked at the sky. The gray had deepened. Not toward storm dark, not yet, but the quality of the light had changed. The horizon to the northwest, which she could see through a gap in the trees, had developed a particular texture. Layered. The kind of layered that meant weather stacked up somewhere and heading somewhere. Hannah knew how to read this. She'd spent 3 winters in Alaska. She'd sat through 2 genuine backcountry weather events and learned from both of them in the specific way that teaches better than any course. She knew what this sky was telling her. She also knew what she was going to do about it. Nothing. Not yet. Continue. And here is the thing she would not say out loud. Not to Roy Marsh, not to Edna, not to the sky or the silent birds. She had checked the weather before she left. The forecast said clear through 6 p.m. Light chance of precipitation after 9. She had read it, understood it, and made a calculation. Except she'd also felt the air change during the drive up from her last job 3 days ago. She'd noted the pressure drop. She'd watched the cloud formations moving faster than the surface wind explained. She had known, in the background where she kept inconvenient knowledge, that the forecast might be wrong. She'd come anyway. Because it was October 14th. Because she was 21 years old, and had been 21 for exactly 0 days, and had not slept well and had not eaten well, and was so tired so specifically, and completely tired of managing the gap between what she needed and what was available that she had made the uncharacteristic decision to do exactly what she wanted, even if it was inadvisable, even if she was walking into a mountain ahead of a weather system. She needed the walk. She needed the specific kind of silence you get above tree line where the world stops requiring things of you. She needed to be somewhere that didn't know her birthday and didn't care, so she kept going. Past the first ridge, past the rock formation that did look exactly like a staircase, which she noted with brief satisfaction. Into the section of trail that got thinner, like Edna said. Into the deeper quiet, she found her rhythm. Boots on frozen ground, breath making small clouds in the cold air. Pack weight familiar and settled. She'd carried this pack in 7 different states and 2 Canadian provinces, and the weight of it felt like the one constant in a life that had moved her around since before she could choose to be moved. She was 3 years old when the first placement ended. She didn't remember that one. By the time she was building memories worth keeping, she'd already learned to pack light and leave fast, and not spend too much time deciding whether she liked a place. The system had done its best. She knew that. Some of the people in it had done their best too. She wasn't angry about it, not in the way that required active maintenance. It was just the shape her life had taken. Flat in places where other people had texture. Missing seams where other people had been stitched together by years of the same kitchen table, the same arguments, the same accumulated shorthand of people who had chosen each other over and over. She'd aged out at 18. Gotten a room in a transitional housing program, which was where she learned about document preservation specifically, because the woman who ran the program kept asking Hannah to help scan the residents' personal documents before anything happened to them. Lease agreements, birth certificates, old photographs, medical records. Things that could prove you existed. That mattered. Hannah was good at it. She was patient and precise, and she had an instinct for what a document could tell you that went beyond its surface content. The physical condition of paper, the way it yellowed, the way ink faded, The way folds weakened over time, those things told you about the conditions in which something had been kept, about how much someone had valued it. She'd built a small, specific skill set, got her first paying job through a historical society in Anchorage that needed someone to digitize 3 decades of handwritten meeting minutes. Then another job, then another. Word of mouth in the small world of people who cared about such things. No office, no benefits, no permanent address. But she knew how to read a document, how to read a landscape, how to read a situation and understand what it required of her. What this situation was starting to require, she knew, was a decision. The sky had gone genuinely darker, not gradually anymore. Fast, the northwest horizon had swallowed the layered look and replaced it with something flat and solid and closing. The temperature had dropped another 2 degrees, and the first particle of something not quite snow, more like frozen intention, landed on the back of her hand. She stopped, checked the hygrometer. 83% humidity. That was high. She pulled out Roy's map, found her position as best she could past the staircase rocks, roughly here, elevation just under 4,000 feet. The trail continued another 1.5 miles to an overlook. She had maybe 90 minutes of reasonable visibility, or she could turn back. Hour and 40 minutes, maybe less at pace, to the trailhead. Hit the car before it got bad. Get back to Creston, get back in her sleeping bag, eat her other granola bar, and accept that she'd walked for 2 hours on her birthday, and that would have to be enough. She stood there for probably 30 seconds, which is a long time to stand still on a narrowing trail with incoming weather. And then she thought, I know what I'll do. I know what the sensible choice is. I have identified it clearly. She folded the map, tucked it back in her pocket, and kept walking north. Because it was her birthday, and she was allowed one inadvisable thing. The weather didn't care about her reasoning. Within 20 minutes, the wind had picked up from the northwest, with the sudden decisive energy of something that had been patient long enough. Snow came with it, not the gentle variety, not the picturesque kind. Small and hard and horizontal, the kind that gets into the gap between your collar and your neck and stays there. Hannah pulled her hood up and adjusted her pace. Steady. Don't rush. Rushing on uneven terrain cost energy and increased fall risk, and she needed both feet operational. She checked her position again with the map, or tried to. The visibility had dropped to maybe 150 yards. The trail was still visible directly underfoot, but the landmarks she'd been using to navigate were gone, absorbed into gray. Here's what she knew. She knew she was north of the staircase rocks. She knew the trail curved east around the next rise. She knew the overlook she'd been heading for was higher, and going higher in this wind was no longer the correct call. She needed to go down, or level, or find cover. She looked at the map one more time. The dot. Roy's pencil mark, unlabeled, northeast of her current position. She hadn't asked him what it was. He hadn't told her, you'll know it when you see it. She pressed northeast. The next 20 minutes she would not fully account for later. Not because she panicked, she didn't. But because moving through heavy wind-driven snow at altitude with zero visibility landmarks is the kind of activity that absorbs the part of your brain that narrates. You're just there. Boots, ground, wind, breath. Repeat. What she knew, she was staying uphill, as Edna said. Avoiding the drainage. Moving carefully. Watching the ground in front of her feet for drop-off or ice. What she felt, the specific cold of elevation wind, which is different from flat ground cold. It has intent. It finds the gap between glove and sleeve. It makes the skin on your face feel like it belongs to someone else. What she noticed eventually was that the trees had changed. Denser. The spruce thicker and older, the kind that grew in a sheltered microclimate, a hollow maybe, or a fold in the terrain that blocked the worst of the prevailing wind. The sound changed too. The wind was still there but farther away, like it was happening to someone else's mountain. She slowed. And through the snow and the dark of the spruce canopy she saw it. She stopped completely, because what she was looking at should not have been there. Her brain said so, plainly, before any other response could form. That is a structure. Structures don't exist here. There are no structures on this trail. The map doesn't show a structure. Therefore, it was there anyway. She stood in the trees for a long moment, not moving, while the wind moved the snow around her and the structure remained and was specific, angles where nature made curves, straight edges, a roofline, dark wood, old wood, the color that timber goes when it's been in weather for a very long time. And then the details resolved as she got closer. Not just a structure. A wagon enormous. The kind of wagon that crossed territories in the previous century that had been transformed, extended, reinforced with timber and a proper foundation and a roof that was not a wagon's roof. Someone had started with a wagon and built a home. Whoever had done it was gone. The snow on the roof was undisturbed. The trees around it had grown close, as if the structure had been standing long enough for the forest to adjust its opinion of where the spaces were. Hannah looked at the door. Old wood, dark and solid. Iron hardware that had stayed on despite the decades. She moved toward it. Climbed 3 steps that had been cut into a stump functional, not decorative. The choice of someone for whom decoration was a luxury, and stood on the narrow porch. Her hand found the door latch. Cold under her fingers. Solid, not rusted shut. Not rotted through. She pushed. The hinges moved, not easily, not with the easy swing of a well-maintained door, but they moved. With a sound like they'd been waiting, specifically, for exactly this much force. The door opened onto darkness and still air. She stood in the threshold. The smell was cold and old, and the particular mineral wood compound of spaces that have been inhabited and then left. Not rot. Nothing had rotted. Which meant something had prevented the moisture that would cause rot. Which meant the construction was better than she'd expected. She stepped inside, pulled out her headlamp. The beam swept the interior, and Hannah stopped moving. Because what she was looking at was not a ruin. It was a room. A small room, yes. A spare room. But a room someone had thought about. Bench along one wall wide, built in with a lip to stop things sliding off. Shelves on the opposite wall, properly joined with notches for jars. A folded table hinged against the timber. Hooks on a beam above her head. Storage compartments built under the bench, flush with small iron pulls. And at the center, slightly off-center toward the north wall, a cast iron stove. Potbelly style, small, black with years of use. Hannah crossed to it, crouched, put her palm against the iron. Cold, obviously cold, but she ran her thumb along the lower vent and found it clear, looked inside. The firebox was clean. Someone had cleaned it. Not recently, but at some point someone had cleared the ash and debris with intention. She sat back on her heels and looked at the stove and understood something. This wasn't a place that had been built and abandoned. This was a place that had been used for years, maybe decades, and then stopped being used, which was different. Someone had lived here, not camped, lived. She looked up from the stove. Her headlamp beam moved across the wall behind it, and there she found the writing. Carved directly into the timber, not painted, not written. Carved with something sharp, by a hand that cared about precision more than elegance. Keep lower vent open during high wind. Below it, spruce splits quickest. Keep pieces short. Below that, if smokebacks, check east flue first. Hannah read these 3 lines several times. Not because they were complicated, because of what they were, instructions. Left by whoever built this, for whoever came after. Written assuming someone would come after. Written in the knowledge that the writer would not be here to explain in person. She felt the particular quality of attention that good primary documents required. You had to get quiet inside to hear what they were actually saying. Strip away what you expected and let the thing itself tell you. What these 3 lines were saying was, I thought about you. I didn't know you, but I thought about you. She got the stove going. It took 4 minutes. She followed the instructions exactly, which was both practical and something else she didn't examine too closely. The fire caught on the 3rd try, small, tentative, and then committed. She sat on the bench and let the warmth begin to move into the room. Outside, the storm was audible, the wind against the walls, the snow accumulating on the roof in a way she could track by sound. It was not getting better. It was getting considerably worse. She was here for the night. She took stock. She had the gear in her pack. She had a working stove. She had shelter that was improbably functional. She had water she could heat. She was fine. She was completely fine. She had been in worse situations than this. She set her pack against the wall and pulled out her thermal blanket and the energy bars and the water bottle, and she put them on the bench in an orderly line. Then she pulled out her scanner out of habit, mostly, and set it down. And then her hand, moving along the bench to test the wood quality, found something. A variation in the surface. She pressed down. A hollow sound distinct from the solid wood around it. She looked, reached under the bench lip, found the iron pull, small, flush, nearly invisible, pulled, a drawer slid out, smooth. The wood had swelled slightly with time, but the joints held. Inside, a bundle wrapped in cloth, tied with what had once been twine. The cloth was faded to a color that was somewhere between ivory and gray. Hannah did not grab it. She looked at it for a long moment first. In her work, she had opened things like this before. Not often, but enough to know the specific weight of a moment when you're looking at something that has been waiting, not sitting. Waiting, those were different, in the same way that Roy's unlabeled dot on the map was different from blank space. She picked the bundle up. It was light, lighter than she expected. She set it on her knees. The fire in the stove was making the room warm, now warm enough that she pushed her hood back. The wind was loud on the north wall, but less loud than it had been. Like it was negotiating with the structure, and the structure was winning. She untied the twine. It was stiff with age, but it held together. She unfolded the cloth slowly, methodically, the way she'd been trained to handle old materials. Inside were letters. A dozen, maybe 15. Folded individual, each one folded into itself and then stacked and wrapped together. The paper was yellowed and brittle at the edges, but intact. The ink had faded to brown, the way iron gall ink fades over time, but the writing was legible. She picked up the top letter, unfolded it with careful hands, holding it by the edges. The handwriting was clear and unadorned, the kind of handwriting that suggests someone who learned to write as a practical skill, not a decorative one. October 3rd. First hard frost last night. Roof held. Clara worried it might not. Wind came from the north and found the gap at the east corner we need to patch before the real cold. Added it to the list. List is getting long. Lucy asked today how long winter was going to last. I told her as long as it lasts. She said that wasn't a useful answer. I told her she was right. Hannah sat very still. She turned the letter over, nothing on the back. She picked up the next one. October 19th. Packed in another 3 cords of wood today. Hands are done. Clara made soup with the last of the dried onion, and it was the best thing I've eaten in 2 months, which tells you something about what the last 2 months have been. Lucy has been drawing maps of everything: the trail down, the creek, the rock formation she calls the stairs. She says she's making a record. I said, a record for who? She said, for whoever comes after. I told her that was a fine thing to do. She said she knew. Hannah read that paragraph 3 times. For whoever comes after. She was 21 years old, sitting in a storm in a cabin that shouldn't exist, on her birthday, which nobody knew about except herself, and she was holding a letter written by someone who had thought about the person sitting here right now, who had thought about her, specifically, without knowing it was her. She went through 4 more letters, learned that Thomas, which was his name, she found it in the 3rd letter, had a specific way of noting small repairs that suggested a man who found satisfaction in problems solved. Learned that Clara's cough was a recurring concern. Learned that Lucy, whose name appeared in nearly every entry, had opinions about everything and expressed them without apology. And then, the letter near the bottom of the stack, the paper a slightly different color from the others, preserved better, or added later, or both. She unfolded it. The handwriting was different, smaller, more slanted, the kind of slant that develops when someone writes quickly because they have things to say and not enough time. Different from Thomas's careful, practical hand. October 14th, 1934. To whoever finds this. I know that sounds like the beginning of something dramatic. It isn't, or it is, depending on where you're standing. I came back here today because it has been 4 years since Father died, and I still haven't figured out what to do with the fact that he built this place with his hands, and nobody is going to remember that except me, and I am 37 years old, and I don't know how to make sure that counts for something. I'm not asking for answers. I'm leaving a letter because Father used to say, if you want something to outlast you, write it down. So, here, if you're reading this, the stove works if you follow the instructions on the wall. The east flue sticks in cold weather. The bench has a drawer underneath with things worth keeping. And you found this place because you needed to, because the weather came in, or the trail disappeared, or you just needed somewhere to be for a while. I want you to know this was built for that. Not just for us. For the next person. Father believed that. He didn't say it in those words. But he built it that way. It's October 14th today. It was his birthday. He always worked harder on his birthday than any other day. Drove Mother crazy. She'd say, Thomas, even the Lord rested. He'd say, the Lord didn't have a roof to patch. I loved him very much. I hope whoever reads this has someone to love like that. If you don't yet, I hope you find them. Lucy Aldridge. Hannah sat with this letter for a long time. The fire in the stove had settled into steadiness. The storm outside had found its pitch and was maintaining it. The room was warm, the drawer was open. The bundle of letters was on her knees. October 14th. That was today. Not the year was 1934, and this was now, and 90 years were between them. But the day, the specific day. Lucy Aldridge had come back to her father's cabin on October 14th, which was his birthday, which was also for reasons that had nothing to do with Thomas Aldridge or his daughter, or this cabin in the woods the day Hannah Ward had been born. Hannah looked at the letter, then at the fire, then at the letter again. She was not a person who believed in signs. Signs required a believer, and she'd trained herself out of that early. Because believing in signs when you were a kid without a family meant constantly interpreting random events as meaningful, and that way lay a kind of madness she'd seen in others and declined for herself. But there was something about this, the specific collision of things. The labeled dot on Roy Marsh's map. The instructions carved for an unknown visitor. The letter written by a woman who had sat in this same room, on a day like this, feeling what Hannah suspected was a version of the same thing Hannah felt most of the time. Not alone exactly, but unwitnessed. Lucy had written for whoever came after, and Hannah was whoever had come after. She set the letter down carefully on the bench beside her, picked up the bundle, went through the remaining letters with her headlamp gently, reading fragments. Thomas's entries, one or two from Clara, the later letter from Lucy, small, particular, ordinary. Records of a life lived in a place most people would never find. She worked until the headlamp dimmed and she switched to the smaller backup. Outside the storm was doing whatever storms did when humans weren't watching. Inside the stove ticked and breathed. When she finally let herself stop reading, she sat in the quiet of the cabin and felt something she could not immediately name. It wasn't happiness. Wasn't peace exactly. It was closer to the feeling of setting down something heavy that you'd carried so long you'd stopped noticing the weight. She put the letters back in the cloth, tied the twine, set the bundle on the bench beside her. Then she reached into her jacket pocket and felt the thermohygrometer which she'd put there out of habit. And underneath it, at the very bottom of the pocket, her fingers found something else. Something she'd carried for months. A small folding ruler wood, old-fashioned, the kind made before metal tape measures replaced everything. She'd found it in a box of items donated to a historical society job in Anchorage 8 months ago. Couldn't explain why she'd kept it. It didn't belong to her, but she hadn't been able to put it down. She took it out, turned it over in the firelight. Outside, the storm was not letting up. Inside, she was alive and warm and in possession of something she hadn't had when the day started. Not answers, not a plan, not $43 becoming any more than $43, but a letter from a woman who had sat in this room 90 years ago and written, "I hope you find them." And maybe that was enough for tonight. Maybe that was exactly enough. She pulled her sleeping bag from her pack, lay down on the bench, and listened to the storm work itself out against the walls of something that had been built to last. Something that had lasted. She slept. She woke up before the storm did, which was backwards. Usually storms made noise on their way out, that final rattle and bluster before they gave up and moved on. But this one left quietly, sometime before dawn. And what woke Hannah was the absence of sound rather than the presence of it. She lay still for a moment. Listened. The stove had burned down to coals. The room was cold at the edges, but the sleeping bag had done its job. Her back ached from the bench, which was flat and narrow in the specific way of furniture built for function and not comfort. She sat up. Gray light was coming through the small window on the south wall. Not dawn gray, later than that. She'd checked her watch. 7:42, she'd slept 9 hours. That was not typical. She was a 6-hour person. Had been since she was 18, and discovered that lying awake in the dark was more exhausting than just getting up and doing something. 9 hours meant something in her had decided, without consulting her, that she was safe enough to actually rest. She rebuilt the fire with the smaller pieces of wood stacked near the stove. Someone had left them there. Split small, exactly as the carving on the wall instructed. And while it caught, she went through her pack and made an inventory of what she had left. 2 energy bars, 1.5 liters of water, everything else intact. She sat on the bench and ate 1 bar slowly, made herself take small bites. The fire came up and she held her hands near it and waited for feeling to return to her fingertips. Then she picked up the bundle of letters. She'd read them last night by headlamp quickly, the way you read when you're cold and tired and trying to extract the essential thing before your brain gives out. This morning she read them differently, slowly, starting from the beginning. Thomas Aldridge. She'd gotten his name from the third letter last night, but in the light of morning she found it earlier in the very first entry, in a line she'd skimmed. He signed every entry the same way. Not, dear so-and-so, not sincerely yours. Just, T. Aldridge date. And then whatever the day had required of him. He was not a lyrical man. He did not describe the mountains or the light or the specific quality of an Alaskan winter morning. He noted what was done and what remained to be done. The roof, the wood, the food stores. Clara's health, mentioned with a restraint that made it heavier rather than lighter the way. Men of a certain generation and disposition noted the things they were most afraid of by not dwelling on them. But Lucy. When he wrote about Lucy, something in his handwriting changed, still controlled, still spare. But the sentences were longer, the detail finer. He noticed the things she said, and wrote them down with the care of a man who understood, at some level, that his daughter's way of thinking about the world was worth preserving. October 28th. Lucy told me today that the cabin should have a name. I asked her what she had in mind. She said she hadn't decided yet, but it should be something that means it's still here. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing. That's usually the right choice when Lucy is working something out. November 3rd. Lucy has been collecting things. Small things: a button, a piece of blue glass she found near the creek, a seed pod from the big spruce by the north wall. She keeps them in a tin on the shelf. When I asked her what they were for, she said, "Evidence." Of what? I asked. Of here, she said. Hannah read that twice, set the letter down. Looked at the shelf on the north wall, the one with notches for jars. It was empty. Whatever tins or jars had been here were long gone. But the notches were still there, cut at even intervals, sized to hold things. Evidence of here. She went through the rest of Thomas's letters in order. They spanned from October 1908 through March 1912, when the dates stopped. Not dramatically, not with any note of farewell. The March entry was about a thaw that had come earlier than expected and the mud it made of the trail. And then nothing. Hannah had done enough document work to know that the absence of letters after a certain date could mean many things. People moved, stopped writing, lost the letters, died. She didn't know which it had been for Thomas, but she understood, from the tone of even his most practical entries, that this cabin had been the center of something important. Not in the historical record sense. In the human sense. He had built it for them, for Clara and Lucy and the life they were trying to make. And he had left instructions on the wall for strangers, because he was the kind of man who built for function, and function included the next person who might need the thing you'd built. She picked up the letter she'd read last night. Lucy's letter. The different handwriting. The later date. October 14th, 1934. She read it again slowly. The detail she'd focused on last night was the date, the collision of October 14th. But this morning she read past it. She read the whole letter. The part about Thomas working on his birthday. The part about Clara going crazy. I loved him very much. And then I hope whoever reads this has someone to love like that. If you don't yet, I hope you find them. Hannah sat with that sentence for longer than she intended. She wasn't a person who spent time on the things she didn't have. That was not a productive use of energy, and she was, at her core, interested in productive uses of energy. But sometimes something caught her at the wrong angle. Like now. Like sitting in a cabin where a woman had written those words 90 years ago, on Hannah's birthday, which was also the birthday of the woman's father, which was also a day nobody had remembered for Hannah, except the cashier at the gas station in Anchorage last week, who'd asked for her ID and said happy birthday when the license confirmed it. The cashier's name she'd already forgotten. She set Lucy's letter down and looked at the shelf again, at the notches, at the empty spaces where things had been. And then she noticed something she'd missed last night. Below the shelf, at the base of the north wall, a section of floorboard that didn't sit quite flush with the ones around it. The gap was small, a quarter inch at most, the kind of thing you'd step over 1,000 times without looking. But Hannah was not a person who stepped over things without looking. It was professionally her entire skill set. She got down on her knees, pressed the board. It moved, not a loose board, a hinged one. She could feel the mechanism when she applied pressure, old stiff but functional. She pressed at the near edge and the far edge lifted. Underneath, a shallow space. The depth of the floorboards plus maybe 2 inches below. And in that space, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with leather cord that had stiffened with age into something close to wood, a package. Hannah did not grab it. She had grabbed things before, in her work, and learned not to. You approached old materials with patience. You got close and you looked and you understood what you were dealing with before you touched it. She looked. The oilcloth was intact, cracked at the folds, but not disintegrated. The leather cord had preserved better than twine would have. Whoever had wrapped this had thought about preservation, had wrapped it to last. She lifted it out, set it on her knees, felt the weight of it heavier than the letters, denser. She untied the cord carefully, unfolded the oilcloth one layer at a time, inside a document folded in quarters, the paper thicker and stiffer than the letters. She unfolded it with both hands and held it up to the window light. A deed. Territory of Alaska. It began across the top in printed letters. Then handwritten below in formal legal script. This instrument certifies that the parcel of land described herein, bounded to the north by the ridge known locally as Carpenter's Ridge, to the east by the unnamed drainage flowing to Creston Creek, to the south by she skimmed the legal description, found the name, Thomas Edward Aldridge, found the date, 1908, found the signatures Thomas's, and a territorial official whose name she couldn't fully read. She turned it over. On the back, in Lucy's handwriting, the same slanted, purposeful hand from the letter, "This is still ours. Do not let anyone say otherwise." July 14, 1934, L. Aldridge. Hannah sat on the floor of the cabin, with a 116-year-old land deed, on her knees and the fire crackling behind her and the storm gone and the morning light coming through the south window at a low angle that put everything it touched in sharp relief. She was a person who understood documents, who spent her working life handling them, reading them, understanding what they said and what they meant, and what the gap between those two things could do to a family, a community, a record of existence. What this document said was this land belongs to the Aldridge family. What it meant right now, this morning, in the context of an unlabeled dot on Roy Marsh's map and an old man's eyes that had stayed on her face 2 seconds longer than a glance she didn't know yet. But she was going to find out. She rewrapped the deed in the oilcloth, retied the cord, put it in her pack, with the letters, wrapped in her thermal blanket for protection. Then she broke down the fire, properly, the way you left a fireplace when you were the last one out. She cleaned the ash drawer. She closed the vents. She looked at the room one more time. The bench, the carved instructions, the shelf with its empty notches, evidence of here. She put her pack on, adjusted the straps, and opened the door. The world outside was white and still and entirely transformed. A foot of new snow on everything, on the spruce branches, on the roof of the cabin, on the steps she'd climbed last night. Her own tracks from the night before were gone, filled in. The sky was that particular post-storm blue that made everything look scrubbed and bright. She was going to have to pay attention on the way down. But first she looked at the cabin from the outside, in the daylight, without the desperation of the storm behind her. It was remarkable, not in a dramatic way. In the way that quietly excellent workmanship is remarkable, the way you notice it by the absence of things that should have gone wrong and hadn't. The roof still had its angle, which meant the structure underneath still held. The walls were plumb. The door fit its frame. Someone had built this to last. And it had. She turned and looked at the trees around it, at the way the spruce had grown close, almost protective, at the drift lines of the snow, which showed you where the wind had come from and where the cabin had been sheltered. Whoever had chosen this site had chosen deliberately. And then she saw it, above the door. She'd come through that door twice last night in the dark, this morning in the dim, and she'd read the instructions carved into the wall inside. But she hadn't looked up. Above the door frame, carved into the horizontal beam, REM 1987. Still standing, she stared at it. REM 1987. 3 initials and a year. Not the band was right about then, actually. But that was not what this was. Someone with those initials had come here in 1987 and carved those words, not as graffiti, as confirmation. Still standing was not a person talking about themselves. Still standing was a person talking about the cabin. Someone who cared enough about the cabin to come and check, and to leave proof that they'd been here. Roy Eugene Marsh. The thought arrived fully formed, which was how thoughts arrived when they'd been assembling in the background for a while. Roy, who'd given her the map, who'd made the unlabeled dot, who'd looked at her with that specific attention, whose name she did not actually know the middle of, but she knew how to find out. She started down the mountain. The descent took 2 hours. She went slowly, testing the snow for ice underneath. Her poles she'd always packed them helped on the steeper sections. She retraced her own route as best she could, using the landmarks she'd noted on the way up, the staircase rocks, the first ridge, the birch grove that marked the turn back toward the trailhead. By the time she reached the fence gap, her fingers were cold, and her legs had that pleasant tired of sustained elevation work. She pushed through, crunched across the flat section toward the road, and saw her transit waiting where she'd left it. She put her pack in the back, sat in the driver's seat, started the engine, and then she didn't drive toward the highway. She turned onto Main Street. The marsh was open. She could see the lights through the window and the open sign turned in the door. The string of 4th of July flags was stiff in the cold. She sat in the parking spot across the street for a moment. Here's what she was doing. She was about to go in there and ask a 68-year-old man she'd met once for 10 minutes whether he'd been inside a cabin that technically wasn't his in 1987 and left his initials on the doorframe, and whether he'd sent her up there with a hand-drawn pencil dot. Because why? Because he thought she needed to see it. Because he knew something she didn't. Because of some reason she didn't have language for yet. She'd learned, over years of working with old documents and the families that wanted them preserved, that the most important questions were the ones people had been not asking for a long time. The ones that accumulated around a box of letters or a drawer full of photographs. The questions that felt too large and too late and too likely to change things to be spoken out loud. Roy Marsh had opened a door for her. Literally and otherwise. She got out of the car. The bell made its spoon sound when she pushed the door open. Warm air, wood heat and coffee. Edna was behind the counter, going through what looked like invoices. She looked up. "You made it," she said. "I did. Storm came in early." "It did. Edna paused. Didn't finish the sentence. "You want coffee, please?" She took the same mug from the same hook. The jar wasn't in place. She put in $1. Roy came through from the back, saw her. Something in his face did the thing it had done yesterday, that flicker of something more than recognition. Quickly contained. "Rough night," he said. "I found shelter, silence." The fire in the wood stove at the far wall ticked and settled. "Good," he said. Hannah set the mug down on the counter. She took the folded map from her jacket pocket, his map, the one he'd given her, and opened it on the counter between them. She put her finger on the pencil dot. "This," she said. Roy looked at the dot, looked at her. His hands were in his pockets. "What about it?" he said. "You knew it was there." "Yes, you've been there." "Yes." She let that sit for a moment, then REM. 1987. Roy's expression changed, not dramatically, but something in the muscles around his eyes shifted, and what replaced what had been there before was something older and less guarded. He pulled his hands out of his pockets and put them flat on the counter. "Roy Eugene Marsh," he said, quietly, not confirming it for her, confirming it for himself. "Your grandmother," Hannah said. "Lucy Aldridge." The word Aldridge in the air between them had weight. She saw him take it. "She married a man named Marsh," Roy said. 1936. Took his name. Didn't talk about the cabin. Not to her kids, not to my mother," he paused. "Just to me. Once, when I was 19. She took me aside one Sunday after dinner, and she told me there was a place in the mountains to the north. She said, if you ever need to know it's still there, go see for yourself. Just don't tell anyone where it is." "Why not?" She didn't say. I thought at the time it was just an old woman's attachment to a memory. The way old people get. His jaw moved slightly. "I went and found it. Took me the better part of a week to locate. And I understood. It wasn't sentiment. She wanted it left alone, undisturbed. She wanted it to still be what it was. And in 1987 you went back." He looked at the map. "I left the mark because..." He stopped. I don't entirely know why. Something about it. That it had been there 79 years and nobody had touched it. I wanted there to be a record, that I'd seen it. Edna had stopped pretending to go through invoices. She was listening with the quality of someone who'd known this was coming for a long time. There's a deed, Hannah said. Roy nodded. You knew. My grandmother showed me a copy. She'd made one before she put the original away. He looked at Hannah steadily. I knew the land was ours. I also knew that knowing it and doing something about it were two different things. Why did you give me the map? This was the question. She asked it flat, no inflection. The way she asked questions when she actually needed the answer. Roy was quiet for a moment, not avoiding the question, arriving at the honest version of the answer. Edna and I talked about it, he said. When you came in, after you left. He glanced at his wife. We've had the deed for 37 years and neither of us has known what to do with it. The cabin's been fine. Nothing's threatened it. The land's so far off any developed path that nobody's bothered. He paused. But you came in asking about the North Trail. On October 14th. Carrying that pack like it was the only thing you owned, and you looked. He stopped. How did I look? Hannah said. Like you could use something to hold on to, Edna said. From across the counter. Without looking up from the invoices she'd gone back to. Hannah's jaw tightened briefly. She didn't argue it. Because it was true, and she knew it was true, and arguing, the truth was a particular kind of waste of time she'd eliminated years ago. There's something else, Roy said. He went to the back. She heard a drawer open. He came back with a piece of paper newer than the deed, but still old enough that the fold lines had gone soft. He unfolded it and put it on the counter. A letter from a county office. Dated 3 weeks ago. Addressed to Roy Eugene Marsh and then 42 Sycamore Street, Creston, Alaska. But their address, she'd seen it on the window, the street number on the glass outside was 412. Not 42. Roy watched her read it. It arrived returned, he said. The post office kept it for 2 weeks. When I finally got a forwarded copy last Monday, I found out what it was. He tapped the letter. Crawford Development filed an application to claim the land parcel north of the Third Ridge. They're calling it abandoned property. The application was filed 8 weeks ago. The response deadline is 16 days from when you got the letter, Hannah said. 16 days from when I got the letter. She looked at the address. 42 instead of 412. One missing digit. The difference between a notice arriving and not arriving. The difference between 16 days and no days. Someone got the address wrong, she said. Or someone wrote it wrong, Roy said. Those were two different things. She looked at him. He looked back. The deed is in your pack, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. You took it from the cabin, to protect it. He nodded slowly. My grandmother would have done the same. Hannah looked at the letter again. Crawford Development. A company name in a small Alaska town, applying to claim a piece of land that had belonged to a family for over 100 years. Because nobody had said it belonged to anyone. Because the person who could have said something hadn't gotten the notice. Because the address had been wrong by 1 digit. She thought about the deed. About Lucy's handwriting on the back. This is still ours. Do not let anyone say otherwise. She thought about Thomas's carvings on the wall. Practical. Directed at whoever came after. She thought about Lucy's letter. For whoever finds this. She picked up her coffee. Drank it. Set the mug down. Who's handling the application, she said. Roy gave her the name of the county land office. The department. The case number which he'd written on a notepad and kept near the register. I'm going to need access to your copy of the deed, she said. And anything else your grandmother left. Any paper documentation of the family's connection to the land. Roy and Edna exchanged a look, the 40-year shorthand kind. We've got a box, Edna said. Been sitting in the back room since my husband's mother passed. Letters, photographs, some certificates. Lucy's things, mostly. She paused. Nobody's gone through it properly. I can go through it, Hannah said. And that was all she said. Not I want to help, or this matters, or let me explain why I care. Just, I can go through it. Because she could, and because it was what needed doing. And because she was a person who dealt in documents and what was inside that box was documents. Roy Marsh looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said. He brought the box from the back. Cardboard, not archival quality, which made her wince slightly, but she didn't say so. Held together with twine, real twine this time, not the ancient kind. He set it on the counter. She opened it. 3 hours later, she had the contents organized into 6 categories on the work table in the back room, which Roy had cleared by moving 2 crates of motor oil and a broken generator to the other side. He'd brought her coffee twice. Edna had brought her a sandwich at noon without being asked. The box contained Thomas Aldridge's original homestead documentation from 1908, including a handwritten claim form and correspondence with the territorial office. Clara Aldridge's record of a medical visit in 1910, which was not legally relevant but was humanly interesting. Lucy Aldridge-Marsh's marriage certificate, 1936, Frederick Earl Marsh, Creston, Alaska. The copy of the deed Roy had mentioned a carbon copy, 1950s era by the look of the paper, made by someone who'd understood the original needed a backup. 7 letters from Lucy to her daughter Roy's mother, Margaret Marsh, written between 1955 and 1969, none of which mentioned the cabin directly, but all of which contained the specific kind of coded attention to land and place that Hannah recognized as someone making sure someone else understood what was important, without being able to say why. And one more thing. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in a piece of muslin that was itself wrapped in a paper grocery bag, a small journal, marbled cover, the size that fits in a coat pocket. She opened it to the first page, LAM, Property Record and Household Notes, 1936 onward. Lucy Aldridge-Marsh. Keeping records after she married. Keeping records the way her father had kept records, practical, dated, specific. Hannah read through it carefully. Lucy noted home repairs, food store, purchases, weather. But scattered through the practical entries were others. Entries that didn't fit the household record format. November 12, 1937. Went up to the north cabin today. Still there. Firewood needs restocking. Will send Frederick next month if weather holds. April 3, 1941. Checked on the cabin. Someone has been using the trail nearby, but has not found the structure. The spruce on the east side are growing closer. Good cover. March 8, 1955. Frederick gone 2 years now. I've been thinking about the cabin and what to do. It cannot stay secret forever, but it also cannot fall into the wrong hands. I have decided I will let it wait. The right person will find it, or they won't. Either way, it will outlast me, which is the best thing Thomas ever built. Hannah stopped at that entry. Read it again. I will let it wait. The right person will find it, or they won't. She looked at the window of the back room, which faced the alley behind the Marsh store. A cat was sitting on a garbage can lid in the snow, looking at its own reflection in a puddle that hadn't quite frozen. She thought, Lucy Aldridge died in 1971. Roy had told her that earlier, without being asked, just said it plainly, like a date he'd known all his life. 1971. Lucy had gone to this cabin 17 or 18 times over 35 years, by Hannah's count from the journal entries, maintained it quietly, made sure it survived, and then she'd stopped going, and the cabin had waited. For 19 years, until Roy went in 1987, and then Roy had confirmed it was still standing, and left his mark and also stopped going, and the cabin had kept waiting. 53 more years, until last night. Hannah turned to the last entry Lucy had made in the journal. November 1969. 2 years before she died. I have done what I can. The deed is safe. The record is as clear as I can make it. Whatever comes after will have what it needs if someone looks. If someone looks. That was the entire thing. The whole of it. Thomas had built for whoever came after. Lucy had kept records for whoever came after. Roy had made a mark on a wall and an unlabeled dot on a map for whoever came after. And Hannah found documents for a living. Was paid in her modest itinerant way to be exactly the person who looked. She closed the journal. Sat back in the wooden chair Roy had brought for her. She realized, no longer thinking about the birthday, not about the gas station cashier and the forgotten name, not about the phone with no messages, not about $43. She was thinking about 16 days. Roy appeared in the doorway. Well, he said. You have everything you need to contest Crawford's application, Hannah said. The deed is original and valid. The carbon copy corroborates it. The journal establishes continuous family awareness and stewardship of the property. She paused. The address error on the notice needs to be reported separately. That's potential grounds for an extension even if the documentation weren't this solid. You know how to file that kind of thing? I know how to document it. I know who to call to file it. She looked at him. Dr. Bernadette Sloan. She's the director of the Alaska Historical Preservation Society. I've worked with her office twice. She's not easy, but she's good, and she has legal resources your county historical board doesn't. Roy leaned against the doorframe. You've been here 24 hours, he said. 26, Hannah said. Approximately. Something crossed his face. Not amusement exactly, but something adjacent to it.
Why? He said.
And there it was. The question she'd been expecting. The one she didn't have a clean answer to, because it's the right thing to do, because the documents are in my hands, and I know what to do with them was true but not complete, not the whole truth. Because, she said, and stopped, and started again. Because Lucy Aldridge wrote a letter to whoever came after and I came after, and I know how to do this. She looked at the organized materials on the table, and nobody's going to tell me that's not sufficient. Roy looked at the table too, at 37 years of deferred action laid out in 6 careful categories. No, he said. I don't suppose they will. That night Hannah set up her scanner on the work table and scanned every document in the box. The deed, the carbon copy, the journal, the letters, the certificates, the homestead documentation, everything. 2 resolutions high quality for the legally significant items, standard for the personal materials. She labeled every file with date, document type, and a condition assessment. She did this until 11 p.m. Roy had offered the spare room above the store, which Edna used for extra stock. There was a cot. Hannah said yes without making it a thing. At 11 she saved the last file, backed it up to her external drive and to her cloud storage, stretched her hands which ached from the scanner work. She should sleep, but she opened Lucy's journal one more time. To that entry from 1955. Frederick gone 2 years now. Lucy's husband had died in 1953. She'd been 46, and she'd kept going up to the cabin alone after that in the journal entries. April 1955. September 1957. July 1962. She'd kept going, kept checking, kept noting the condition of the roof and the firewood and the east flue, kept making sure it was still there. Hannah thought about that, about the specific quality of attention required to maintain something for decades when nobody else knew it existed, when nobody would notice if you stopped, when the easier choice every single time was to let it go. She thought about the deed in the oilcloth. This is still ours. Do not let anyone say otherwise. Written in 1934, when Lucy was 27 and her father was 4 years dead and she'd come back to the cabin alone on his birthday. She thought about the carved instructions on the wall. Practical. Left for a stranger. Written with the certainty that the stranger would come, even if Lucy would never see it. She turned to the scanner, found the image of Lucy's letter, the one from the hidden drawer. October 14th, 1934. I hope whoever reads this has someone to love like that. If you don't yet, I hope you find them. Hannah sat with her laptop and her scanner, and the images of 90-year-old documents and the specific silence of a back room above a general store in Creston, Alaska, on the night after her 21st birthday. She had not in 21 years had someone who maintained something quietly and without recognition because it mattered. Had not had someone who made a mark on a wall to say, I was here, this is still standing. Roy had made that mark. For the cabin. Not for her. But he'd also made a dot on a map and given it to a stranger on a day he couldn't have known was her birthday, because she'd looked like someone who needed something to hold on to. And Edna had said so out loud without apology. She closed the laptop. The folding ruler was in her jacket pocket. She took it out and set it on the table in front of her. Turned it in the light. Old wood. Brass fittings at the joints. The kind of ruler made before metal tape measures took over everything. She'd found it in a donation box in Anchorage 8 months ago, in a collection of miscellaneous household items someone had dropped off without inventory. She'd held it and couldn't put it down. Couldn't explain why. Had been carrying it since. She picked it up. Unfolded it one segment. 2. Thomas Aldridge had measured every plank in that cabin with something like this. She didn't know that. She didn't know anything about what tools he'd used. But she thought about Lucy's journal entry, Frederick, gone 2 years now, and about the way Thomas's letters noted the practical details of building, of repair, of maintenance, the satisfaction in a problem solved. She folded the ruler back up, put it in her pocket. 16 days. She was going to need to call Bernadette Sloan in the morning. Sloan was not an easy person to reach on short notice. She was also the best person Hannah knew for exactly this kind of work, and Hannah Ward did not have time to be strategic about her connections. She also needed to go back to the county land office and look at the Crawford application herself, not the copy, the original filing. She needed to see the address discrepancy in the official record, not just on a forwarded notice. She needed to understand whether it was a single error or a pattern, and she needed to do both of these things while not having a fixed address or a steady income or anything that the official world typically required of a person trying to make an official claim. She was fine. She had done more with less before. She turned off the scanner, put on her jacket, went up to the cot in the storeroom. Before she lay down, she looked out the small window at the end of the room. The street below was empty. Main Street, Creston, Alaska. 800 people, one diner, one hardware store, one general store with a string of 4th of July flags on the roofline. Somewhere north of this town, a cabin was sitting in 2 feet of new snow. Still standing, she lay down, closed her eyes, and for the second night in a row, she slept without setting an alarm. Bernadette Sloan picked up on the second ring, which meant nothing. Sloan picked up fast because she screened calls and only answered the ones she'd already decided were worth her time. If Hannah had called from an unknown number, it would have gone to voicemail. The fact that Sloan answered meant she still had Hannah's number in her contacts, which meant she hadn't deleted it after the Anchorage job, which was, in the economy of Bernadette Sloan, something close to a warm reception. "Ward," Sloan said. "No, hello, I'm in Creston. I need 15 minutes. You've got 5. I'm in a meeting in 6. I found an 1908 homestead cabin on a land parcel that Crawford Development is trying to claim as abandoned property. Original deed is valid and in my hands. Family heirship is documentable through direct line. The county notice went to a wrong address 1 digit off and the response window closes in 16 days. Silence. 3 seconds. 4. Send me everything you've scanned," Sloan said. "I'll look at it today. I need a call back today." Ward. "Today, Bernadette." Another pause. "This one's shorter. I'll call you by 4, Sloan said, and hung up. Hannah set her phone on the work table, picked up her coffee. It was 7:40 in the morning and she'd been up since 5:30, and she had already organized her files, drafted a summary of the documentation, and eaten the last energy bar from her pack while standing over the scanner. She was fine. She was completely operational. She did not need anyone to tell her she was doing the right thing because she already knew she was, and other people's confirmation was a resource she'd learned to manage carefully, the way you manage water in a dry stretch. She sent Sloan the files, all of them, labeled, dated with condition assessments attached. Then she put on her jacket and went to the county land office. The county land office was in the next town over Millhaven, 14 miles east on a road that had been mostly plowed after the storm but retained a specific kind of treachery in the shaded curves. Hannah drove carefully, arrived at 8:55, which was 5 minutes before the office opened, which was intentional. She stood on the sidewalk in the cold and went through what she was going to ask for. The woman who opened the door at 9 on the dot was 50, maybe, reading glasses on a beaded chain, a name tag that said Dorothy. Dorothy took one look at Hannah and made an assessment that Hannah could see happening behind her eyes and did not particularly enjoy but also was not going to argue with. Young. Passing through. Probably here about something minor. "Can I help you?" Dorothy said. "Not a question. I'd like to review the public record for a land claim application. Crawford Development, filed approximately 8 weeks ago. Parcel north of the Third Ridge, Creston area." Dorothy's assessment updated slightly, not dramatically, but her posture changed. "That file's in process," she said. "Public record files are available for review during process," Hannah said, politely. "Specifically, I'd like to see the original application and the notification list." Dorothy looked at her for another moment. Then she went to a filing cabinet. The file was thorough. Crawford Development had done their paperwork carefully. The application was complete. The supporting documentation was in order. The legal description of the parcel was accurate. They'd hired someone who knew what they were doing. Hannah went through every page, took photos of each one with her phone. When she got to the notification list, the list of addresses that had been sent the required public notice, she found Roy Marsh's entry. Roy Eugene Marsh, 42 Sycamore Street, Creston, Alaska. She looked at it for a moment, then she took a photo. Then she asked Dorothy, is there a record of who prepared the notification list? Dorothy looked at the file. It would have been processed by our office. Is there a specific staff member assigned to this application? A pause. I'd have to check. Please. Dorothy checked. Came back with a name Hannah didn't recognize. She wrote it down. Is that person in today? He's on leave. Of course he was. She thanked Dorothy and went back to her car. She sat in the parking lot and looked at the photo of the notification list. 42 Sycamore. Not 412. One digit missing from the middle of the address. Not a transposition, a deletion. The kind of error that happened when someone was careless. Or the kind that happened when someone was careful in a way they didn't want noticed. She didn't know which it was. She couldn't know yet. But she could document that it existed. She drove back to Creston. Sloane called at 3:47. The deed is valid, Sloane said. Unambiguously. If Crawford is claiming abandoned property, they are going to have a significant problem when this document surfaces. That's what I thought. The journal entries are useful corroborating evidence for continuous family stewardship. That's good. A pause. Hannah could hear Sloane's particular kind of thinking silence, the one that preceded the part you actually needed to hear. The address discrepancy is either a clerical error or it isn't. Either way, it gives you grounds to request a deadline extension, and the board will likely grant it because they won't want the liability if it turns out not to be an error. How quickly can your office get involved officially? I can file a preservation interest notice by end of week. That puts my organization formally on record as having a stake in the property's historical classification, which gives us standing to request documentation review. Sloane paused. That buys you time. It doesn't win you the thing. I know. What wins you the thing is the deed and the heirship documentation going before the county board directly. That needs to be the Marsh family presenting Ward. Not you, not me. Roy Marsh will present. You've spoken to him. He gave me the map that led me to the cabin. A longer pause. That's a story, Sloane said. There are several. Save them for the board. Sloane's voice shifted, not warmer. Exactly, but more direct. You're doing the right thing here. The cabin sounds remarkable. If it's what the documentation suggests, it's a significant find. It's not a find, Hannah said. It's been there the whole time. The family knew, nobody else looked. Silence. Then I'll file by Friday. She hung up. Hannah stood in the back room of the Marsh store with her phone in her hand and the afternoon light coming through the window at a flat October angle and felt something specific. Not triumph. Not relief. The steadier thing. The thing that came when a plan had been correctly assembled and the pieces were moving. She went out front. Roy was restocking fishing lures in the glass case. Edna was nowhere visible. Sloane's filing a preservation interest notice by Friday, Hannah said. Roy closed the glass case. What does that mean exactly? It means your family has 2 weeks to present the deed and documentation to the county board. It means Crawford's deadline gets extended while the board reviews. It means the application doesn't go through quietly. Roy straightened up. He had that stillness that came with a certain kind of careful man, not passive, just thoughtful about where he spent his energy. The board meets on the 28th, he said. I've been to those meetings before. About other things. They're not hostile, but they're not. I know, Hannah said. I'll prepare the documentation for presentation. You'll present it. I'll be there if you need anything clarified. You'll be there, he said. Like he was verifying something. Yes. He looked at her steadily. You're planning to stay in Creston for 2 weeks. She hadn't, until that moment, put it that way to herself. She'd been operating sequentially, next task, next task. She hadn't stood back and looked at the whole of what she'd committed to. She had a job waiting in Fairbanks. She'd need to call and postpone. She had $43, which had been supplemented by the cash she kept in the transit for emergencies, another $60. But which was not a sustainable operating budget for 2 weeks in a town with limited accommodation options. And she had, in a storeroom above a general store in Creston, a cot that was not comfortable but was warmer than her transit. Is that a problem? She said. Roy turned to look at Edna, who had apparently materialized from somewhere in the back without either of them noticing. She was holding a cast iron skillet with the authority of someone who owned one and used it regularly. Dinner's at 6, Edna said. I made extra. That was not an answer to Roy's question. It was a replacement for it. Hannah understood the distinction. Thank you, he said. The next 11 days had a shape that Hannah would later have difficulty describing to anyone who hadn't lived the particular rhythm of a small town working against a deadline. Mornings, documentation. She organized, cross-referenced, and built a presentation package that a county board of 6 people could follow without needing a degree in archival science. She made it clear and sequential. She made it boring in the way that good evidentiary documents were boring, unambiguous, dated, sourced. Afternoons research. She drove to Millhaven 3 more times. Dug through the county historical records, which were partially digitized and partially boxes of folders in a room that smelled of old cardboard and institutional neglect. She found the original homestead claim records for the Creston area, all of them, not just the Aldridge parcel. She found references to the Aldridge property in 2 separate county surveys, from 1915 and 1932. She found, in the 1932 survey, a note in the surveyor's margin, structure intact, North Ridge Quadrant, not abandoned in use. That notation, from 1932, was gold, because it established that the property had been in known use within living memory of the current generation, which directly contradicted Crawford's abandoned property claim. She photographed everything, scanned what she could, built a timeline. Evenings, the Marsh kitchen. This was the part she hadn't planned for. Edna cooked dinner at 6 every evening with the regularity of someone who believed that regular meals were a form of moral infrastructure. She made the kind of food that required a cast iron skillet and time pot roast, chicken and biscuits, a bean soup that simmered all day and smelled like it. Roy ate everything put in front of him with the methodical appreciation of a man who understood what it took to produce it. Hannah ate at their kitchen table every night for 11 days. She was not sure how that had happened, exactly. The first night she'd been invited and had said yes because it was impractical not to. The second night there had been a place set for her when she came downstairs at 5:58. After that it had simply become the structure of the days. She did not talk much at dinner. Neither did Roy. Edna talked enough for both of them about customers, about the weather coming in or going out, about the neighbor's dog who had gotten into the garbage again, about a recipe she was considering trying once she found buttermilk at a reasonable price. It was not the kind of conversation that required Hannah to perform anything. She could just sit there, with her hands around a warm bowl, and listen. She hadn't known that was something she needed until it was happening. On the 5th evening, Roy put down his fork and looked at her across the table. "Tell me about the work you do," he said. "The regular work. Before this," she told him. The short version: 7 states, 2 Canadian provinces, historical societies and small museums and private collections. Documents that needed to be preserved before they fell apart. The way you could read a paper's condition like a diagnostic. What the angle of a water stain told you about how a box had been stored. What the color of iron gall ink told you about its age. Roy listened the way he did everything. Thoroughly. "You learned all of that by doing it," he said. "Mostly, some from reading. Some from people who let me watch. No school." "No." He nodded, like this confirmed something he'd already thought. "Thomas was like that," he said. "According to my grandmother. He could build anything, but he'd never had formal training. He just figured it out, by looking at how things worked and then doing them." Hannah looked at her soup. "She told you a lot about him," she said. "More than she told anyone else." Roy was quiet for a moment. "I think she needed someone to tell it to. My mother wasn't interested in old stories. My aunts were busy." He paused. "I was the one who would sit still long enough." Hannah understood that. Being the one who would sit still. Being the one who paid attention when others moved on. She'd never thought of it as a skill. More like a default setting. A particular frequency she'd been born to. On the 8th day she found the record that changed the shape of the case. She'd been going through a secondary archive, the kind of supplementary file that county offices kept for documents that didn't fit cleanly into primary categories. Old correspondence mostly. Internal memos. Notes from board meetings going back decades. In a folder from 2019, a memo from the county land office to Crawford Development. Not formal. Informal. The kind of communication that happened between a county employee and a private developer when someone in the county office was facilitating something they were supposed to be neutral about. The memo was brief, 3 sentences. It said that the land parcel in question had been identified as potentially claimable under the abandoned property provision, that the homestead records were old and possibly incomplete, and that with appropriate timing, the application could proceed without significant opposition. It was signed, not with a full name, initials BK. Hannah stared at the memo for a long time. The staff member who had prepared the notification list, the one Dorothy had named, the one currently on leave, his last name started with K. She'd written it down. She checked her notes. Kevin Burrell, BKB, Burrell, or Burrell K, depending on which way you wrote initials. Except this memo was initialed BK, not KB. She looked at it again. She looked at it for a long time. Then she photographed it, carefully, from 3 angles. She drove back to Creston faster than the curves strictly supported. Roy, she said, walking through the front door of the Marsh. Roy was behind the counter. A customer she didn't recognize was looking at motor oil. She waited until the customer left. The address error wasn't random, she said. She put her phone on the counter. The photograph of the memo on the screen. Roy read it. Slowly. Read it again. This was in the county archive, he said. Secondary file, 2019. That's 5 years before Crawford filed, yes. Roy was quiet. Very quiet. The kind of quiet that meant he was recalibrating something large. They've been planning this for 5 years, he said. Someone inside the county office has been facilitating it for 5 years, Hannah said. Which is different from Crawford planning it. Crawford may not have known the address was wrong. Or they may have. I can't tell from this. Does it matter? For the board presentation, what matters is that the deed is valid and the property isn't abandoned. The memo is it's additional. It changes the character of what happened. It shows this wasn't a simple error. Roy looked at the memo photograph for another long moment. Then he looked up. Are you going to tell Sloane? He said. I already sent it to her, Hannah said. 12 minutes ago. Roy's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. Edna appeared from behind the curtain with 2 cups of coffee. She set them on the counter and looked at the phone screen. Read the memo. She said, and went back behind the curtain. Sloane called within the hour. Her voice had a different texture than usual, still controlled, but something under the control that Hannah recognized as the professional equivalent of this just got very interesting. Where did you find this? Sloane said. Secondary archive, county land office. 2019 folder. You were looking through 2019 county archives. I was looking through everything. Ward. A pause. This is significant. I know. This needs to go to the board chair directly. Not as part of the presentation. Before the presentation. They need to know there's a conflict of interest question inside their own office before they walk into that room. I agree. I'll call the chair today. A beat. You did well. Hannah didn't say anything to that. She wasn't sure what to say. Sloane compliments were not frequent and they didn't come with instructions for receiving them. I'll be at the meeting, Sloane said, and hung up. The night before the board meeting, Hannah couldn't sleep. This was not unusual. She was a 6-hour person, which meant that anything requiring more than 6 hours of lying still tended to become an exercise in ceiling study around the 4-hour mark. She got up, went down to the back room, turned on the small lamp on the work table. The presentation materials were laid out. She'd been through them so many times she could recite them. The deed, the carbon copy, the 1915 survey reference, the 1932 survey notation, Lucy's journal entries, the family lineage from Thomas to Clara to Lucy to Roy, the memo. It was solid. She knew it was solid. She sat down at the table, folded her hands on top of the organized folders, looked at them. She'd spent 11 days building this case. 11 days in a back room above a general store, eating pot roast at 6 p.m. and driving to Millhaven and scanning documents until her hands ached. 11 days in a town that was not her town, for a family that was not her family, for a cabin she'd spent one night in. She had a job in Fairbanks she'd postponed. She had $63 left. She had a Ford Transit with a busted heater on the passenger side, so. Why? She'd told Roy, because Lucy wrote a letter and I came after. Because I know how to do this. Both true, neither complete. The fuller truth was harder to say without sounding like something she didn't allow herself to sound like. The fuller truth was that she had sat in a room where someone had built instructions into the walls for the next person. Had found a letter written for someone the writer would never meet. had held a deed wrapped in oilcloth by a woman who knew it mattered even when no one else was watching. And she had understood. In the specific and irreversible way, you understand things that find you when you've stopped looking, that this was what it looked like. When someone thought about you without knowing you. When someone maintained something for you without knowing you needed it. When someone left a light in the window of a place you didn't know you were heading toward. She'd never had that. Not in 21 years. Not once, not from a person who was supposed to give it, but a woman named Lucy Aldridge had given it to a stranger in 1934. Had wrapped a deed in oilcloth and written, "This is still ours. Do not let anyone say otherwise." And Hannah Ward was, at her core, a person who did not let people say otherwise. She picked up the folding ruler from the corner of the table where she'd set it after the first night, turned it over, opened it partway. 1 segment. 2. She thought about Thomas Aldridge measuring planks. She thought about the way he wrote about repairs, the satisfaction in solving things. The satisfaction of a problem met with the right tool. She was the right tool for this particular problem. Not because she was remarkable. Because she was specifically suited. Because document work was what she did and documents were what this needed, and she was here. That was enough. That was exactly enough. She folded the ruler back up, put it in her jacket pocket, went back up to the cot. She slept 4 hours, which was enough. The board meeting was held in the basement of the Millhaven Municipal Building. 6 board members behind a long table. 20 or so people in the folding chairs, county officials, a couple of journalists from the regional paper, several Creston residents Hannah didn't know by name but recognized from the marsh. Crawford's attorney was there. Young, well-dressed, composed in the way of someone who had done this many times and expected the standard outcome. Roy sat beside Hannah in the front row. He was wearing a button-down shirt that he'd ironed himself, she could tell by the slightly uneven crease at the collar. Edna was 2 chairs down, hands folded in her lap, watching the board the way she watched everything, specifically and without any visible anxiety. Bernadette Sloan arrived 4 minutes before the meeting started. 60, square-shouldered, silver-haired, with the particular energy of someone who had decided the most efficient path through any room was a straight line. She sat on Hannah's other side without introduction and put her briefcase on the floor. "You look tired," she said to Hannah. "I look prepared," Hannah said. "Same thing," Sloan said. The board chair opened the meeting. He was in his 60s. A man named Gerald Farrow who had, Sloan had told Hannah, been informed about the memo 2 days prior and had spent those 2 days being visibly uncomfortable about it. He looked uncomfortable now. He also looked like a man who understood the difference between institutional embarrassment and the kind of problem that became something much worse if not handled correctly. Crawford's attorney presented first. Smooth, efficient, confident. The application met all statutory requirements. The property had been unclaimed for decades. The county stood to benefit from development of underutilized land. Standard arguments. Well delivered. Then Roy stood up. Hannah had spent 2 evenings preparing him for this. Not coaching him, he wasn't someone you coached. Showing him what the documents said, and in what order the story they told was most clearly understood. He'd listened with that particular thoroughness of his, asked 3 precise questions, and then said, "I can do that." He could. He stood at the presentation table with the deed in front of him, and he spoke without notes. He told the board about his grandmother. About the cabin Thomas Aldridge had built in 1908. About the deed signed in the territory of Alaska before it was a state. About Lucy coming back after her father died and making sure the record was kept. About the copy his grandmother had made. About the journal. About the county survey from 1932 that noted the structure was not abandoned. He spoke simply. He didn't try for effect. He said what was true. When he got to the notification address, he held up the letter. 42 Sycamore Street. He said, "My address is 412. He said, "I don't know how the digit was lost. What I know is that the address in the county's own file was wrong, and because it was wrong I didn't receive the notice in time, and that my family has owned this land for 116 years. He sat down. Sloan stood up. She presented the preservation interest notice, the historical documentation, the 1932 survey marginal notation. Then she put the photograph of the 2019 memo on the projector. The room changed quality. The way rooms do when something that was below the surface comes up. Crawford's attorney had not seen the memo. Hannah could tell by the way his composure shifted, if not collapsed, but reconfigured. He looked at it, and then he looked at the board. And then he looked at something on the table in front of him. Gerald Farrow looked at the memo on the screen for a long time. Then he looked at the board member next to him. Then he looked at Hannah, for the first time since the meeting started. She looked back, calmly. "We're going to recess for 30 minutes, Farrow said. They recessed for 45. When they came back, Farrow's posture was different. Not loose, he was not a loose man. But the uncomfortable thing was gone, and had been replaced by something more like resolution. The kind of resolution that arrives when you've decided what the right thing is and accepted that doing it is going to be complicated but necessary. "The board is placing the Crawford development application on administrative hold," he said, "pending review of the notification procedures used in this case and the documentation of ownership that has been presented today." He looked at the table. "The hold is effective immediately. A formal hearing will be scheduled with all parties present." Crawford's attorney started to speak. Farrow held up a hand. "The hold is in effect," he said. "Your client will receive formal notice by the end of the week." It was not a victory, it was not a final ruling. It was a pause, official and documented in the process that had been moving toward an outcome nobody had tried to stop because nobody had known to stop it. But it was the right pause, in the right place, made for the right reasons. Hannah looked at the deed on the table in front of Roy. Thomas Edward Aldridge, 1908. The paper worn but intact. The signatures clear. Roy looked at it too. Then he looked at Hannah. She waited for him to say something. He didn't. He just looked at her with that steadiness of his, the kind that came from knowing what things cost and deciding they were worth it anyway. Outside the municipal building on the sidewalk in the October cold, Sloane stopped beside Hannah. "Well done," Sloane said, and walked to her car. Hannah stood on the sidewalk. Edna was talking to someone from Creston she knew. Roy was beside her, hands in his pockets, looking at the parking lot. The cold was clean. The sky was the same October gray it had been 11 days ago, when Hannah had driven into Creston for a cup of coffee and an unlabeled dot on a hand-drawn map. She put her hand in her jacket pocket, found the folding ruler, held it. She thought about the carved words above the cabin door. REM 1987. Still standing. Roy had climbed up there and made that mark. He'd wanted there to be a record that he'd seen it, that it was still there. She thought about Lucy's journal. The right person will find it, or they won't. She thought about what Roy had said about his grandmother. "I was the one who would sit still long enough." She thought about herself, at 18, scanning lease agreements and birth certificates in a transitional housing program because someone had asked, and she'd turned out to be good at it. At 19, in a storage room in Anchorage with 3 decades of handwritten meeting minutes. At 20, driving across state lines with her scanner in its padded sleeve because the work existed wherever she went and she needed to go somewhere. At 21, standing in an October parking lot in Millhaven, Alaska. Hands that ached from 2 weeks of scanner work. $63. A job in Fairbanks she'd postponed by 10 days and would need to address by morning, and something else. Something she didn't have a precise word for yet. The thing that was not victory and not relief but was more solid than either. The thing that came from doing the specific work you were made for in the moment it was needed. Roy walked up beside her. They stood there for a moment without saying anything. The parking lot was emptying. People were getting into cars, going back to their ordinary days. "What happens now?" Roy said. "The board reviews. The hold gives us time to prepare for the formal hearing. Sloane's office will file the preservation classification paperwork in parallel, which gives the cabin additional legal protection even if the land question takes longer to resolve." Hannah paused. "Crawford can still challenge at the hearing, but they're going to have a harder time arguing abandoned property when the documentation shows continuous family knowledge and the memo shows the process wasn't clean." Roy nodded. "And the man who prepared the wrong address. That's the county's problem to handle. Not ours." She looked at him. "Our problem was the cabin. That problem is paused in the right direction." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Low, brief. "You say paused. I say what's accurate." "Fair." He looked at the sky. "You've got somewhere to be. I have a job in Fairbanks. I postponed it. I need to get there by the end of the week." He nodded. "Not trying to change it, just receiving the information." "The room is yours through Friday," he said. "Edna would want me to say through the weekend, but I'm saying through Friday, because you seem like someone who doesn't like owing things." She looked at him. He was right. He was exactly right. And it was strange, not unpleasant, but strange to be read that accurately by someone she'd known for 11 days. "Through Friday," she said. They walked back to their respective cars. Edna waved from across the lot. Hannah waved back, got into the transit. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine. The cabin was north of here, north of Creston, up the trail she'd walked on her birthday, through the trees and the silence and the storm that had sent her exactly where she'd needed to go. It was sitting in its fold of terrain with its carved instructions and its empty shelf and its cold iron stove and the beam above the door, where Roy had left his mark at 32 years old, still standing. The deed was in Sloane's custody now. Official. Documented. Safe. The cabin wasn't going anywhere. Hannah started the engine, turned the heat up on the driver's side, the only side that worked. Let the cab warm up. She had until Friday. She had work to do in Fairbanks. She had $63. And something else. The thing she'd been carrying without a name since she'd woken up on a bench in a storm-held cabin on her birthday and read a letter from a woman who had thought about her without knowing her. She didn't have a name for it yet, but it was there. Specific. Not quite warm, but warmer than what had been there before. She pulled out of the parking lot and drove back toward Creston. Back toward Roy and Edna Marsh. Back toward the store with the 4th of July flags on the roofline and the coffee that was better than the gas station kind, and the kitchen table where Edna cooked dinner at 6 every evening, because she believed that regular meals were a form of moral infrastructure. She still had 4 days. 4 days was enough time for a great many things. She left for Fairbanks on Friday morning. Roy carried her scanner case to the transit without being asked. Edna came out without a coat, which meant she hadn't planned to come out at all, which meant she'd decided at the last moment and hadn't taken the time to go back for the coat. She handed Hannah a paper bag. Hannah looked inside. 2 sandwiches, an apple, a container of soup sealed with tape. "For the drive," Edna said. "It's 4 hours, roads are icy past the junction." Edna said this in the tone of someone who was not going to discuss it further. Hannah put the bag on the passenger seat, closed the door, turned. Roy was standing with his hands in his pockets. The same posture as the first day. The same careful stillness. "Sloane has everything she needs," Hannah said. "The formal hearing date will come through in the next 3 weeks. You'll need to be available to present again, same materials, more formal setting. She'll prepare you." "All right, the 1932 survey notation is your strongest secondary evidence. Don't let anyone steer the conversation away from it." "Hannah." She stopped. "I know," he said. Simply. Like those 2 words covered everything she'd been about to say and also several things she hadn't. She looked at him. Then at Edna, who was standing in the cold without her coat, looking entirely unbothered by that fact. She didn't say thank you. She wasn't sure thank you was the right word for what had happened here, and she was not a person who reached for words that didn't fit. What she said was, "I'll call after the hearing." "We'll be here," Edna said, in the tone of someone stating a permanent geographical fact. Hannah got in the transit, started the engine, pulled out of the parking spot in front of the marsh. At the corner of Main and Sycamore, she looked in the rearview mirror. Roy and Edna were still standing on the sidewalk, side by side, just watching her go. She turned onto the highway, pointed the transit east, let the engine settle into its highway rhythm, which was different from its town rhythm, and both were different from its cold start rhythm. She knew every sound this vehicle made, had learned them the way you learned a language you lived inside of. The road curved north and the mountains opened up on both sides. The sky was doing something complicated with light, thin clouds moving fast, the sun getting through in long diagonal shafts that moved across the snow, like something looking for something. She drove, ate 1 sandwich, left the soup for later. She thought about the cabin. About Thomas Aldridge at whatever age he'd been when he'd decided that a wagon was a foundation and not a vehicle. The specific audacity of that. Most people look at what they have and see what it is. Thomas Aldridge had looked at a wagon and seen what it could become, and then had done the work to make it that, plank by plank, in Alaskan winters, with a wife who watched and a daughter who collected evidence of here. She thought about Lucy keeping the journal. All those years. All those entries. The faithful record of a place nobody else was watching. She thought about Roy climbing up that mountain alone and carving his initials above a door. Not for recognition. Because he wanted there to be a record that someone had been there. That the thing was still standing. She thought about Edna handing her soup for a 4-hour drive without asking whether she wanted it. The highway flattened out past the junction. The mountains receded. The sky went to pure gray, which in this part of Alaska in October was its default and its preference. Her phone buzzed. Sloan. She answered on the car speaker. The county chair called me this morning, Sloan said. No preamble, no hello. And? Kevin Burrell submitted his resignation last night. Effective immediately. A pause. Which he did not have to do and was not yet asked to do. Which tells you something about what he knew and how long he'd been waiting for it to surface. Hannah kept her eyes on the road. Does that affect the hearing? It strengthens our position significantly. The board is now aware that the notification process in this case was compromised by a staff member with an undisclosed relationship to the applicant. They're not going to want to proceed with Crawford's application while that investigation is ongoing. So Crawford withdraws. Crawford will withdraw. They won't say that yet, but they will. Sloane's voice was flat, factual. The way Sloane delivered things she was certain of. The formal withdrawal will probably come in the next 2 weeks. The hearing may still happen, but it'll be procedural at that point. The cabin, Hannah said. I'm filing the historical preservation classification Monday morning. Once that's through 3 to 4 weeks, the property has protected status regardless of any future claim. Sloane paused. It's a significant structure, Ward. I had 2 colleagues review your photographs. The construction method, the timeline, the integrity of the materials, this is important work. It was there the whole time, Hannah said. The family knew. Nobody else looked, yes. Sloane's voice shifted slightly, still controlled, but something underneath it. What you did was good work, you should know that. Hannah said nothing. I mean that without qualification, Sloane said. I know you do, Hannah said. Thank you. She hung up, drove another 20 miles in the flat gray quiet, then she pulled over. Not because anything was wrong. Because something was happening in her chest that required her to not also be driving. She pulled onto the shoulder and stopped the engine and sat. Crawford was withdrawing. The cabin was going to be protected. Roy Marsh was going to keep the land his grandmother had kept. The deed Lucy had wrapped in oilcloth and annotated in her slanted handwriting was going to mean something in a court and a record and a formal proceeding. This is still ours. Do not let anyone say otherwise. Nobody had said otherwise. Because Hannah had not let them. She sat on the shoulder of the highway with her hands in her lap and the engine cooling and the gray sky doing its gray thing above the mountains. She was 21 years old. She had $59. She had a job in Fairbanks she was 4 hours from and hadn't called to confirm her revised arrival time. She had a busted heater on the passenger side and a scanner in its padded case and a folding ruler in her jacket pocket. And she had done something real. Something that was going to last. Something that would be in a county record and a historical society archive. And eventually, on a sign outside a cabin in the mountains north of a town of 800 people. Thomas Aldridge. Built 1908. He'd built it for them, and for whoever came after. She started the engine. Drove to Fairbanks. The Fairbanks job was 3 boxes of land survey records from the 1940s that a small historical society had received from an estate donation and had no staff capacity to process. Hannah arrived Friday evening, assessed the materials, and understood within 20 minutes that it was going to take 6 days instead of the 5 she'd originally quoted. She called the director and said so. The director said fine and asked her to be done before Thanksgiving. She worked in a back room of the Historical Society with a space heater and a folding table and light that came through a north-facing window. She supplemented it with a clip lamp she'd been carrying in the transit for 2 years. The records were a different kind of work from the Aldridge materials. Survey documents had their own language measurement, notation, reference point. They told you about land in the way a report told you about land. Systematically. Without feeling. She found she kept thinking about Lucy's journal, about the way Lucy recorded the same general North Alaska landscape but from inside it, not measuring it, living in it, noting the mud and the early thaw and the quality of summer light through the spruce. 2 ways of knowing the same place, one left in county archives, one left in a hidden drawer. On her third evening in Fairbanks, she found a document in the second box that stopped her. Not stopped her dramatically. Stopped her quietly, the way the most important things tended to arrive. It was a record of a community organization. 1964. A small welfare fund established to support adults aging out of or transitioning from the Alaska territorial and then state welfare system. The fund provided transitional housing assistance, emergency food support, and listed third specifically vocational skill support. The fund's founding donor was listed as anonymous, but the legal signatory, the person who had done the official paperwork to establish the fund as a recognized organization, was listed by name: Lucy Aldridge-Marsh, Creston, Alaska. And beneath that, in the column for legal representative assisting with establishment, Roy Eugene Marsh, Creston, Alaska. Hannah read those 2 lines several times. Then she turned the document over, nothing on the back. She turned it face up again. Lucy Aldridge-Marsh, Roy Eugene Marsh, 1964. Lucy had been 57 in 1964. Roy had been 21. Roy had told her that Lucy had taken him aside when he was 19 and told him about the cabin. That had been 1962. 2 years later, they had together established a welfare fund. Not just together. Roy had done the legal paperwork at 21 years old, which meant Lucy had asked him, which meant she had trusted him specifically with something she cared about enough to make official and funded and lasting. Hannah looked at the fund's description again. Adults transitioning from the Alaska welfare system. Transitional housing assistance. Vocational skill support. She set the document down on the table. Sat back in her chair. She did not know, sitting there, whether Lucy's fund had reached the specific program she'd spent 2 years in. She didn't know, and she couldn't know from this document alone. The fund had operated from 1964 onward. She could see that much from the filing. What it had supported, which organizations, which years, that would take more research. That would take Sloane's resources and access she didn't have from a folding table in a Fairbanks back room. But she knew this. Lucy Aldridge had thought about people she would never meet, had put money and paperwork and Roy's time behind that thinking, had built something designed to keep running after she was gone. The same woman who had wrapped a deed in oilcloth and written, "This is still ours." The same woman who had left a letter in a hidden drawer for whoever came after. Hannah photographed the document, sent it to Sloane with a message. "Can you trace this fund's operational history?" Looking for which organizations it supported and through what years. Specifically whether it was still active into the late 1990s and early 2000s. Then she put the puff face down on the table and went back to the survey records. Because the survey records needed doing. Because she'd said she'd have them done in 6 days. Because that was the work in front of her. And she was a person who did the work in front of her. But she thought about Lucy for the rest of the evening. About the specific quality of a person who builds things without needing to see where they land. Sloane's answer came 4 days later. A Wednesday. Hannah was finishing the last box of survey records when the message came through. She read it standing at the folding table with the clip lamp throwing its small circle of light across everything. The fund had operated continuously from 1964 through 2006. It had supported 11 organizations over that period. The last organization on the supported list which had received fund contributions through 2003, 3 years before the fund dissolved following the death of its final trustee, was a transitional housing program. In Anchorage. Sloane included the name. Hannah looked at the name. She sat down. She was already standing technically, but she sat down, hard, in the folding chair that made a noise when she did. It was the same program, the same organization. The same address she'd had from age 18 to 20. The place where a woman named Dolores had handed her a scanner and asked if she wanted to learn how it worked. She stared at the name on her phone screen for a long time. Lucy Aldridge had never known Hannah Ward existed, had died more than a decade before Hannah was born. But the fund Lucy had built with Roy's help in 1964. The fund a 21-year-old Roy had done the legal paperwork for, because his grandmother had asked, had contributed to the program that gave Hannah a room and a space heater, and the beginning of every skill she'd built her life around. Hannah put her phone down on the table, looked at the north-facing window. Outside Fairbanks in November was fully dark by 4 in the afternoon. The window showed nothing but the reflection of the room and herself in it. She looked at herself in the window for a long moment. She was not going to say that Lucy had known. That was not what this was. This was not a story about someone arranging events across generations for a specific person. This was a story about someone building something good and leaving it running. About something good continuing because other people maintained it. About the way that care, when it's genuine and sustained, moves through the world without the person who started it knowing where it ends up. Thomas had built a cabin with instructions for strangers. Lucy had kept it standing and built a fund for people who needed a start. Roy had kept the secrets and made the marks and handed the map to the right person when the right person appeared. And somewhere in that long chain of maintained things, Hannah Ward had gotten a room and a scanner and a skill set, and eventually a storm that sent her into the right mountain on the right day. She was not going to make it more than it was. She was also not going to make it less. She picked up the phone, sent Sloane a reply, "Thank you." And then she sat in the quiet of the Historical Society back room and let herself feel whatever it was she was feeling, which didn't have a clean name but was real and specific, and sat in the center of her chest, like something that had been cold for a long time and was just now starting to warm. She finished the Fairbanks job on Thursday, delivered the processed files, accepted payment, shook the director's hand, got back in the transit. She had $59, a job inquiry in Juneau she hadn't responded to, a scanner in its padded case, and a folding ruler in her jacket pocket, and something she was carrying with her toward Creston that she hadn't carried away from it. She was going to tell Roy in person, not over the phone, not in a message. The thing she'd found deserved the room around it, the specific room of being in the same place as the person you were telling, where you could see their face and they could see yours, and nobody had to translate silence through a speaker. She drove south. April came the way April came in Alaska, tentatively, like it wasn't entirely sure it had the right address. Snow still on the north-facing slopes, mud on the trails, the kind of cold that wasn't winter anymore but hadn't decided to be anything else yet. Hannah drove into Creston on the 14th, April 14th, 6 months to the day from when she'd first pulled into this town with a birthday nobody remembered and an itch she couldn't name. She noticed that, briefly, set it down. The marsh looked the same. A new string of 4th of July flags on the roofline, brighter than the last ones. The open sign in the window. Warm light inside. She pushed the door open. The bell made its sound. Edna looked up from behind the counter, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. Coffee mug in one hand, invoice in the other, which was apparently just how Edna existed in the world. She looked at Hannah. "You made it," she said. "I said I would." "You did." She set down the mug and the invoice. "Roy's up at the cabin. He went early." "I'll go up. There's soup on the stove." Edna said this to Hannah's back because Hannah was already at the door. The trail was different in April. Mud underfoot where there'd been frost. Birch starting to leaf small and pale, the tentative kind that came before the real ones. The spruce darker green against 6 months of remembered gray. She climbed without rushing. She knew this trail now. The staircase rocks were still there. The trail thinned past them. The trees came in closer, and then through the tree line the cabin. Roy was on the roof. He was replacing 2 shingles on the south-facing slope, moving with the deliberate care of a man who took maintenance seriously. He heard her boots on the wet ground and looked down. He looked at her for a moment, went back to the shingle. "I thought you were coming Thursday," he said. "I said the 14th. I thought that was Thursday. It's Wednesday." A pause while he set a nail. "Edna had soup ready for Thursday. She has soup ready today. She always has soup ready." Another nail. "Hand me that square." The framing square was sitting on the second porch step. She picked it up, climbed the short ladder, handed it up to him. Their hands touched briefly around the metal. She went back down, stood on the porch, and looked at the sign, "Good wood." Well finished. Routed letters. Not painted, routed lasted longer. Thomas Aldridge would have approved. Aldridge Homestead, established 1908, Alaska Historical Register. Below that, smaller text. Not in the official designation language. Sloane had read her the exact language when the classification went through. And this was not it. Built by hand. Still standing. She looked up at Roy on the roof, who added the last line. Not a question. She already knew. "Edna," Roy said, without looking up from the shingle. Of course it was. Hannah sat down on the porch steps, looked at the mountain. April mountains softer at the edges than October, the light warmer, the sky a tempting blue in a way October didn't bother with. 3 separate ridgelines visible through gap in the trees. Layered, always there, not always seen. Roy came down the ladder, set the framing square on the porch, stood beside her and looked at the same view. Crawford withdrew formally in February, he said. Sloan told me. Burrell's case is still with the county, could take a year, I know. A pause. Roy sat down on the porch steps beside her, the appropriate distance of 2 people who had worked closely on something hard and were still figuring out what came after. Sloan wants the letters in the permanent collection, he said. With the journal. That's right for them. I asked her to make sure they could still be accessed. Not just stored, people who want to read them should be able to. She'll do that. Roy nodded. He looked at the sign, at Edna's edition, still standing in smaller letters below the official text. She drove me crazy about that line, he said. Wanted it from the beginning. I said the designation had specific language. She said the designation language was fine and also missing the point. She was right, she usually is. He said this without any detectable irony. 42 years. You'd think I'd have the math figured out on when to just agree. They sat in the kind of silence that didn't need filling. A woodpecker started somewhere in the spruce behind the cabin, found its rhythm, kept at it. Hannah had been carrying something since Fairbanks. She'd been carrying it for 6 months, technically since the night she'd sat in the Historical Society back room and looked at her own reflection in a north-facing window. She decided then to save it for this moment, for here, for this porch and this man and the specific room that being in a real place with a real person made around a thing that mattered. I found something, she said, in the Fairbanks archives. Roy looked at her. What kind of something? She told him. The fund document, Lucy's name as founding donor. His name Roy Eugene Marsh, age 21 as legal representative, 1964. The fund's operational history through 2006. The 11 organizations it had supported. The last one on the list. She said the name of the program. Roy was very still. You were in that program, he said, from 18 to 20. Silence. The woodpecker. The April wind moving through the upper spruce. Roy, she paused, chose the words carefully. Did you know? When you gave me the map. No hesitation, nothing performed about the answer. I helped grandmother set it up. I knew the fund kept running after she died. I was on the trust through the 80s before I stepped off. But I didn't track which programs it was supporting by then. I didn't. He stopped. No, I did not know. She believed him. She was not a person inclined toward easy trust. But Roy Marsh was not a man who performed. She'd been around him for 2 weeks and had watched him say exactly what was true and nothing more and nothing less. This had that same quality. When I walked into your store, she said, I saw someone who looked like she needed to see that something old could still be standing, he said. That's the whole of it. The whole of it. She turned that over. Lucy built something in 1964, Hannah said. And it ran for 40 years. And somewhere in those 40 years it put money into the program, where I learned how to do the only work I've ever been able to do. She looked at the mountains, and then I walked into a storm and found her father's cabin, and used that work to keep it. Roy said nothing for a moment. He was looking at the sign, at the routed letters and Edna's addition beneath them. She wrote a letter for whoever came after, he said finally. I know. I've read it probably 30 times. She meant it. He paused. I don't think she knew what she meant exactly. I think she knew she meant something. A long beat. Some things you put in motion and you don't see where they go. You just have to trust the thing you built. Hannah looked at her hands. The specific hands of a person who handled paper for a living, careful, unhurried, attuned to things other people walked past. I don't know what to do with it, she said. The fact of it. You don't have to do anything with it, Roy said. It already happened. It already is what it is. He looked at her sideways. Some things you carry forward. Some things just carry you for a while. Doesn't require you to decide which one this is. She sat with that. The woodpecker stopped, reconsidered. Started again on a different tree. After a while Hannah reached into her jacket pocket, took out the folding ruler, held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it. The brass joints, the old wood. She'd been carrying it for 9 months, since the donation box in Anchorage. She'd never been able to explain why she'd kept it, not to herself and not to anyone else. She held it out to Roy. He looked at it. Didn't take it immediately. "Where did you get that?" he said. "Donation box in Anchorage, 9 months ago. I couldn't put it down. I've been carrying it since." She paused. Edna recognized it. "In October," she said, "Lucy's journal mentioned Thomas's folding ruler. That he measured every plank in this cabin with it." Roy looked at the ruler in her hand. A careful, long look. "You can't know that's his," he said. "No. It could be anyone's. It could." He looked at it for another moment, something working in his face that wasn't quite emotion but lived in the same territory. Then he reached out and took it, turned it over, opened it one segment. The brass joint caught the April light and held it. He didn't say anything for a while. Just held it. The way you hold something when you're trying to understand what it means to you before you decide what to do with it. "Keep it," Hannah said. "It belongs here more than it belongs in my jacket pocket." He closed the ruler, held it flat in his palm. "I'll put it at the shelf," he said inside. "Good." He stood, went to the cabin door, opened it. The hinges moved the same way they'd moved that first night, with the particular sound of something long waiting. He crossed the floor. She heard the small sound of something being set down on wood. Carefully, in the right place, he came back out, closed the door, sat back down on the steps. They sat in silence for a while. Not the waiting kind, the full kind. "She'd have liked you," Roy said. Hannah looked at the mountains. "Lucy?" "Yes. Because I found the deed, because you didn't need to be asked to look." He said it simply, like it was the most obvious thing. That was what she was, too. A person who looked without needing to be told. Hannah thought about the journal entries, about Lucy going back to the cabin 17 times in 35 years, alone after Frederick died, because someone had to make sure it was still there. About Lucy setting up a fund in 1964 with a 21-year-old Roy doing the legal work, because Lucy had decided it needed doing and had found the right person to help. About the letter in the hidden drawer. Written for no one specific. Written for everyone who might come. "I hope you find them." She found ways, Hannah said, to care about people she'd never meet. "Yes." Roy's voice was quiet. She said, "Once I was maybe 17, she said. The only thing that actually travels is what you put in motion, not the things you hold on to." Hannah looked at the sign, at the routed letters. At Built put the cabin in motion. Thomas had put the fund in motion. Roy had put the map in motion. And here she was, on a porch in April, with mountains in front of her and soup on the stove in town, and a job inquiry in Juneau she hadn't answered yet. She was 21 years old. She had $59, and a Ford Transit and a scanner case, and a life that had the specific shape of someone who had been moving for a long time without knowing where to. She thought, maybe this is where to. Not permanently, not with a fixed address and a lease and all the apparatus of staying, but where to for now, for this particular chapter of things. Edna put a cot in the storeroom again, Roy said. "I noticed the light was on up there when I drove in. She aired it out last week. I told her she was jumping the gun. A beat. She said she wasn't. She wasn't, no." He looked out at the mountains. "You should stay through the preservation ceremony. Sloane's office is scheduling it for the end of the month. She'll want you there. I was going to ask about that. Edna will cook something. She's already planning something." He paused. "She won't tell me what. She says I'll have opinions, will you?" "Probably." He said it without apology. Hannah looked at the cabin door, closed now. The ruler on the shelf inside. The thicker walls, the careful joints, the hinges that had moved in the dark for 116 years. She thought about the night she'd first come through that door. The storm outside making the inside feel like the only quiet place left in the world. The fire she'd built from instructions carved into wood by a man who'd thought about her without knowing her. She'd walked in out of a storm she'd chosen not to avoid, and everything after that had been a consequence of that choice. Not a magical consequence. Not a fated one. Just a consequence. One thing leading to another, the way things do when you're paying attention. "How'd you and Edna meet?" Hannah said. She'd asked this in October and gotten the story, but she wanted to hear it again, for the particular pleasure of a story that settled something. Roy looked slightly surprised. Same as last time she'd asked. Like he kept expecting a different question. "She came into my father's store," he said. "Back when it was his. She was buying a mousetrap. She told me I'd shelved the hardware wrong and explained at some length the correct method. Then she bought the mousetrap and left. And you fixed the shelving. That afternoon. And she came back. Next morning, something in his face that wasn't quite a smile but was in the neighborhood. She seemed almost disappointed it was done. Like she'd been hoping for another reason to come explain something. She was looking for a reason to come back, Hannah said. Yes, he said it quietly. That's exactly what it was. They sat on the porch steps of the Aldridge homestead in the April light, the mountains in front of them doing what mountains did, being present, and enormous and entirely indifferent in a way that was, paradoxically, the least lonely thing Hannah had ever sat in front of. After a while, Roy stood up, picked up the framing square from the porch. Come back for dinner, he said. 6 o'clock. I know when dinner is, I know you know. He headed for the ladder, apparently planning to do something else on the roof before the light went. I'm saying come back. There's a difference. There was a difference. She understood that. She stood up, adjusted the pack she'd carried up out of habit, looked at the cabin one more time. The door, the window, the sign with its routed letters and Edna's addition in smaller text, built by hand, still standing. She thought about Thomas measuring planks with a folding ruler, about the specific satisfaction of a board that fit exactly where it was supposed to, about Lucy pressing her hand to that same wall decades later and deciding to keep what he'd made. She put her hand against the door frame for a moment, the wood under her palm, old and solid and exactly where it had always been. Then she took her hand back, started down the trail. Behind her she heard Roy go inside, his footsteps crossing the floor she'd crossed herself in a storm 9 months ago. The door swinging shut with that sound it made, the specific sound of something closing that was also the sound of something that had been worth building. She walked down through the spruce and the pale April birch, through the staircase rocks, through the clearing where the world opened up again. Her boots in the mud, the smell of thaw everywhere, the woodpecker still at it somewhere in the trees, working a problem it had apparently decided was worth the time. She came out through the fence gap and crossed to the marsh, pushed the door open, the bell. Edna looked up, already moving toward the stove before Hannah had both feet inside. Soup, Edna said. Please, Hannah said. She sat down at the counter, put her pack on the floor, looked at the shelf behind Edna where the mugs were and the jar was in its same place. She'd been gone 6 months. The jar was in the same place. The mugs on the same hooks, the wood stove at the back of the marsh doing its quiet work, the string of flags on the roofline outside catching the afternoon wind. Some things you could count on, not because the world was designed for your comfort, because certain people decided that something was worth maintaining and then maintained it, day after day, season after season, without waiting to be asked. Edna set the bowl down in front of her. Hannah wrapped both hands around it, felt the warmth move into her palms, up through her wrists, into the cold parts of her that had been cold since October, and maybe longer than that. She picked up the spoon. She was going to stay through the preservation ceremony. She was going to answer the Juneau inquiry afterward and probably take the job. She was going to keep moving, because that was the shape of her life, and she was not under any illusion that a porch in Creston had replaced the transit, or the road, or the next box of deteriorating documents that needed someone patient enough to go through them. But she was going to come back. She understood that now with the specific clarity of things that don't announce themselves dramatically, just become true, quietly, on a Wednesday in April with soup going warm in her hands. She was going to come back because Roy had said come back and meant it without pressure, which was the only kind of comeback she'd ever been able to hear. She was going to come back because Edna kept a cot aired out and didn't discuss it. She was going to come back because the cabin was on the register now, and the sign was up, and there was work still to be done, the digitization ongoing, the permanent collection being organized, the documentation that would let anyone who wanted to find Thomas and Lucy Aldridge find them, because Lucy had written for whoever came after, and Hannah was whoever came after. And that meant something. Not a destiny, not a miracle, just a fact. A real and specific fact about how care moved through the world when people bothered to put it in motion. She finished the soup, set the spoon down. Edna was back behind the counter, going through invoices with the reading glasses just pushed up on her forehead. Not wearing them, just transporting them from room to room on her face. Good? Edna said. Not looking up. Good, Hannah said. Edna nodded, turned a page. Outside, the afternoon light was doing the thing Alaska light did in April, arriving at angles October didn't attempt. Finding surfaces October left in shadow, making the mountains look like they'd been waiting all winter to be seen properly and were finally getting the chance. Hannah sat at the counter for a little while longer, not because she needed to, because she wanted to, because sitting somewhere and wanting to stay, even briefly, was not nothing, was in fact the specific thing she'd been driving toward for 21 years without knowing it had a shape. At 5:52 she put on her jacket, picked up her pack. "I'm going back up," she said. 6 o'clock, Edna said to the invoices. "I know." She pushed the door open, the bell, the cool April air on her face. The street of Creston doing its early evening thing, a car going past, someone's porch light coming on, the smell of wood smoke from the houses set back from the road, 800 people and their ordinary days. The same as any other Wednesday in April. Except not quite. Because the cabin was on the register now. Because the letters were going into a permanent collection where anyone could read them. Because a 21-year-old with $59 and a folding ruler she'd given back, and a scanner in its padded case, had walked into a storm on her birthday and paid attention. Because Thomas Aldridge had built something to last, and it had lasted. Because Lucy Aldridge had written for whoever came after. Because Roy Marsh had made a mark on a wall and an unlabeled dot on a map and handed it to the right person without knowing she was the right person. Because Edna Marsh kept a cot aired out and soup on the stove and came outside without her coat when it mattered. Hannah walked up the street toward the Marsh house where the kitchen light was already on. She could smell dinner from half a block away. She didn't knock. Edna had told her in October that knocking was for people who weren't expected. She pushed the door open and went in. And this time, unlike October, unlike November, unlike every place she'd walked into and out of for the past 3 years, she did not, in the back of her mind, begin calculating how long until she'd have to leave. She just went in, sat down at the kitchen table, and stayed.